Welcome, everyone, and welcome back, Rabbi Phil. I'm going to be taking up where I left off 2 weeks ago. So we are into the Middle Ages, or more specifically, the time period 1000 to 1500, a period that took over many pre-existing stereotypes and myths about Jews, and built on them, but also introduced new ones. And we'll be looking at this evolution that we see notably in the period between 1000 and 1500, which really set the stage in so many ways for modern antisemitism. And I thought I would start with some of really a number of myths about the Jewish body that start to become popular during this period. Then I might briefly give you an anecdote that about 35 years ago, a Hillel student, OSU, that she'd recently had a very strange encounter with a middle-aged woman who was in a particular class with her. And the instructor had encouraged the members of the class to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about themselves, and this girl mentioned that she was Jewish. Then she noticed that this older student kept staring at her balance of the period. And then at the end of class, the woman came over to her and asked her if it was all right if she felt her head. And, this is not your everyday request, but anyway, the girl said, well, okay. So the woman began to feel around. And finally, she drew back and she said, you don't have horns. I had heard that Jews had horns. Another quick anecdote goes back even further than the first one did, about 55 years. I was in a church in Rome that is mainly famous for housing a very famous statue of Moses. And there was a guide who was going around with a group of Americans, and when he was speaking English to them, walked up to the statue, pointed to Moses' head. This is why there is a myth that Jews have horns. And to give you a little background on this, I'm going to read just a bit from the book of Exodus, chapter 34. Moses has just left from his audience with the Lord, taking the tablets down to where the Israelites are at the foot of Sinai. Quote, and it came to pass when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in Moses' hand, when he came down from the mount, that Moses knew not that the skin of his face sent forth beams while he talked. Well, the Lord talked to him. And when Aaron lays now down with the Israelites, And when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face sent forth beams, and they were afraid to come nigh him. And now we skip ahead to about 300 or 350 in the Common Era, and Jerome translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin, into what is known as the Vulgate. And in this, there were beams. Apparently he wasn't quite sure how to work with that. Anyway, he used for the Latin cornua, meaning horns. Well, these were worms of light. And Moses's forehead on his skin anyway. But after all that build-up, I must say that although this may explain the horned Moses, this mistranslation by Jerome, it doesn't really explain the horned Jew in general. We might recall that Moses is certainly respected, perhaps revered in Christianity and Islam, as well as in Judaism. So it was one thing for Moses to be imagined with horns. It's another for Jews in general. And to understand why it became a belief that Jews in general had horns, well, it has very different derivation. It goes back to the proposition I set out in Lecture 1, that there was a belief in the close association between Jews and the devil. As pictured here, of a Jew attending Magnan's throne. And here, Jew conjuring the demon, or perhaps the devil himself, from the blood of a crucified child. Note that this demon or devil has horns. The devil was usually imagined as having horns. Here he's wearing a crown. The Jew who's attending him is wearing a turban. These would conceal the horns. Nevertheless, the belief that Jews have horns basically goes back to the idea that they are the progeny of Satan, and that Satan has horns, so have they. And to get a fuller sense of that, which I'm all look forward to the slide and see some Jewish demons. This is a 16th century illustration, but it could well have been 13th and 14th century. This does go back a long way. And by the way, the question of how we can tell they're Jews, well, look at that circle on their cloaks. That is the Jewish badge of its time. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 ordered that Jews wear a distinctive badge of some sort, so people would know they were Jews. The common type during the balance of the Middle Ages and for some time later would be this circle of cloth sewn onto one's cloak. Note, by the way, this one individual riding aid. This is a Udenzau. I'll be talking about the Udenzaus in a minute. But for the moment, yeah, he is indeed riding a aid. As for the other Jews, yes, one of them is horned. The other has his ears protruding. They're all supposed to walk the way Satan was thought to look. He borrowed his horns from goats, which were basically his animal. And you can see here one has goat's hooves, other has chicken legs. But the Jewish body didn't end at the horns, it extended down. The Jew was thought to look very, very strange, but strange in ways that were reminiscent of Satan. One of the beliefs about the Jewish body. Another was that it was deformed, most particularly that the Jews were hunchbacked. And here we have a 17th century English scholar in John Rushworth complaining at his critics, whom he had many because he was politically radical, that his critics were puff-backed, as it is reported of the Jews. Okay, where did this come from? Well, it came from a common belief of the period that the body reflected the soul. And for a famous illustration, I'll refer to a very well-known song by Shakespeare in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, titled "Who is Sylvia?" Beautiful woman. She's the subject of the song. And at one point, the singer was this line: "Is she kind or she is fair? For beauty lives with kindness. A beautiful soul is reflected in a beautiful body." It works the other way too. The Jews were thought to have twisted souls, so it was only natural that they would also have twisted bodies. And then there were Fetor Judaicus, the Jewish strength. Jews were thought to exude just a horrific stench. Why was this? Again, goes back to this association with the devil. The devil was thought to exude a horrific stench. His minions, his demons, they exuded a horrific stench. There's a corollary to this belief that Jews likewise exuded this horrific stench. And it was that if they were baptized, baptismal waters would immediately wash away stench, and it would be replaced by a wonderful aroma. So it was the evil that made them stink. So there were many other beliefs about the Jewish body and how it was shaped, and was always a detrimental way. That's one thing that we see so much of as we move into the high and later Middle Ages, and that would extend even down to the brain, as I indicated in that anecdote that I gave earlier. Even today, there are people who believe that Jews have horns. I'm going to get into a broader topic. Jews and non-Jews, mockery of all religions. I talked about that Judenzahl before. The image commonly portrayed of a Jew doing something where they paid. We saw a Jew riding on the back of a pig. Here is another illustration of Jews interacting with a sow in various ways, drinking her milk, to other acts that you can probably see on the slide, so I don't have to describe them. This, by the way, here's Corvallis German woodcut. A lot of these works are women. They come from elsewhere too, but I'd say particularly Germany. And there are debates ongoing about whether, particularly the statues of Judenzow, to be removed and hidden somewhere so that the public does not have to be bothered by them. I guess I might mention he was also thought to eat pork and really desire it. Now, this is, note, by the way, the Knorr illustration, and there's more of a satirical flavor to it. It's looking so anxious, looking greedily at Piglet that he's going to devour. Okay, why should Jews be associated with doing all these things that we would say, boy, even the most basic dietary restrictions would say that they're not supposed to do? Well, that was because it was widely believed that Jews, or at least Jewish scholars, knew full well that their religion was not a religion at all. In essence, it was a subject of mockery to them. They pretended to believe it, but they didn't really. And it was also, there were rumors that Jews had written this down, scholars had, and their statements were somewhere. And at times, Christians would attempt to locate the secret literature of the Jews where they admitted that Judaism was false. But beyond that, they mocked not only Judaism, they mocked all religions. That was a common belief. And the Judenzow represents that. Here, another scene of mockery. Those Jews are depicted visiting a church, and there's a pietà there, and there's the sculpture overall with a relief of Mary holding the infant Jesus, and the Jews are mocking it. It was widely believed that Jews exulted in repeating killing Jesus. It wasn't something that among themselves they disowned, but on the contrary, they tried to repeat it symbolically. One of the ways they did this was by desecrating the host. The host was, in earlier times, the small loaf of bread that was, when consecrated by a priest, would immediately be changed into the body of Jesus. And this was used in the Eucharistic service, later in communion. And it was thought that Jews would somehow gain possession of the host, would then abuse it in some way, as Jews are doing here. They're stabbing it with knives, recalling the crucifixion. Anyway, belief that the Jews were guilty of host desecration brought about one of the greatest massacres of Jews in the Middle Ages, when a German known to us only as Rindfleisch There's a lot of speculation on whether he was a lower level nobleman or whether he was a by trade or a butcher. Anyway, there was a rumor that in a particular community, the Jews had gotten a hold of the host and they had desecrated it, and Rindfleisch raised an army or mob that, according to him, this is in 1298, that went around Germany. Chronicles talk about his army destroying 146 Jewish communities and killing, estimate vary tremendously, but somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 in any case. This is a very large-scale massacre, probably the worst in Europe since the First Crusade. There are sources that say that he was eventually hanged, and the cities where the Jews were killed had to pay large fines, but not to recompense the Jews somehow, but rather the king. Man, first knower of all, they'll call blood libel. You may recall that when I was discussing Josephus, I mentioned that Josephus tells a story that claims that Appian, the Egyptian antisemite, had claimed that Jews were murdering Greeks in a ritual way. They were burning their bodies and devouring them. About 300 years after Josephus, an important early Christian theologian named Eusebius told this story again, but he said that the victims of the Jews were Christians, polytheists, the way Appian was talking about it. They were Christians, and particularly they were Christian children. This seems to link on. First, linked up, if we read episodes of mobs being inspired by this idea of Jews killing Christians. And there were some riots that resulted, some Jewish deaths in the early Middle Ages. But then we don't read about any more instances until we get to 1144. And in the English city of Norwich, a little boy is found murdered, and the Jews are immediately accused of this. They are, in this case, protected by local law enforcement, but still, apparently, some of them were killed. But what really sets it all is an event in 1255 in the English city of Lincoln, where a little boy named Hugh is found murdered. The rumor gets out that the Jews were responsible. And in this case, 98 of them were tried and hanged for participation in the murder of Hugh. And after that, this really takes off around Western Europe and Central Europe. He was being accused of murdering little Christian boys. This is another one. Simon. And always their blood is drained. Farters. Question is, why were they thought to be draining the blood? Well, there were different beliefs. One was that they drank it. Another was that these crimes tended to take place around Passover, and the blood was used to bake matzah. Another was that Jewish women sometimes had difficulty delivering children, and the blood would be smeared on their abdomen so that they could give birth. We have major trials for ritual murder into the 20th century. It becomes a more popular crime that's ascribed to the Jews back during the Middle Ages, but it, like all things I'm talking about, it has a long life to it. Okay. Move on. And Hebrew state nation. It was very common in the Middle Ages, as had been even in antiquity, that Jews were just naturally disloyal and cared only about themselves. They were poor subjects, not care about obeying the laws that other people did. An alternative belief that they were also establishment. That is to say, that they would serve the interests of a particular monarch. Usually this was someone that was very unpopular. And one of the accusations against him was that he employed Jews as court. An interesting case happens in Castile, the largest kingdom in Spain in the Middle Ages. In 1351, a civil war breaks out against the king, Peter of Trastamara, his brother Henry, who accuses him, among other things, of having Jews in his employ. He gives them important positions in government. Peter is eventually captured and killed in 1369. And Henry takes over as king and promptly starts to hire Jews for his court too. But by this time, there had been a number of riots, number of mob actions, number of cases where Henry of Trastamara's mercenaries had killed Jews. We can talk in terms of certainly several thousand, probably between 5,000 and 10,000 Jews were killed in Castile in response to this idea that they were propping up the monarchy under Peter. So Jews could also be looked on as establishment. And the image of the court Jew, one, and I mentioned that there were Jews who were employed at courts. I mentioned though there were some with the Emperor Charlemagne back around 800, but it seems to worry people more when we're into the Middle Ages. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of court Jews. One is Leopold of Prague, was a physician who served the Duke of Brandenburg as his financial advisor. After the Duke died in 1571, Leopold was tried for poisoning, which would have been a very stupid thing to do. He had a very good position there, but anyway, he was accused of having poisoned him. He confessed under torture. And this is what happened to Leopold. He was drawn and quartered. And now I'll give you an even more famous case. A man named Joseph Juskin Oppenheimer, known as Jus, who was a financier. He was brought to the court of the Duke of Württemberg in the early 18th century. He served there. And again, the Duke died, and Oppenheimer was accused of having killed him. He would later be executed. There are sources that say that the local bishop told him that if he would just convert to Christianity, accept baptism, that he wouldn't be harmed, but Tyler refused to do that. So he was executed. And he somehow became the model of the evil king's Jewish counselor. Here is a contemporary portrait of Oppenheimer. And if you look at it, the artist has those demons will fly around Oppenheimer's head. But if you just look at him, he looks like a wealthy 18th century gentleman. He's not, in this respect, a caricature of a Jew. He just as easily have been a Christian. But Ulysses would later turn the legend of Zeus into a film in 1940, where there are many anti-Semitic films. And instead of having the guy, could look like a Christian, we have the film program. Looks very different. Looks, first of all, very sinister, but he also looks very Orthodox and very Jewish, shall we say. Well, the moral is still the same, though. It's how dangerous it is to have a Jew in government, because all he cares about is himself and other Jews, and he is going to somehow rob the people blind, as Oppenheimer was accused of. Among the negative stereotypes, Jew is one of the most basic, and it was not known at this time, carried on from much earlier roots, but the association between Jews and wealth. Well, he was exploited. One can immediately think of the model of Shylock, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, the Jewish moneylender. But now I should add that Shylock is really a very interesting character. There is lots of excuse to be sympathetic toward him. And as a matter of fact, the way he is portrayed in theater now, when Merchant of Venice is performed, is usually in a sympathetic way. Thus, this is how the Jew is so often seen, the Jew as moneylender. One thing that's happening in the late Middle Ages is that bankers are virtually all Christian. They're the ones who are making the big loans to wealthy. The Jews are often restricted to money lending, often to people who are not that wealthy, because they have been pushed out of the finance market. So here we see a representation of a Jewish moneylender, as you can see, German 15th century. And notice the people who are coming to him, trying to repay their debts. They're poor people, or lower middle class at least. They're not wealthy. Here's a guy giving you a ring. This was how Jews were so often seen. Moreover, there was resentment of Jews who were wealthy. The stereotype of the wealthy Jew, there was resentment of that. There was resentment of what was seen as high status that was allowed to Jews. There was a sense God did not want that. He did not want the Jews to be successful. He wanted them to be desperately poor and suffering. Think some examples of that. Another stereotype that was dangerous, yes, we could say wasn't a stereotype at all. It was the interpretation of the stereotype. Jews in the Middle Ages overwhelmingly lived in urban centers. They were really the only significant group that did. These were heavily agrarian societies. But what is problematical here is not that Jews lived in cities, whereas most people didn't, but that it was widely resented. I talked before about nationalism and how dangerous it could be. Nationalists would constantly ask the question, who is the nation? Not just people within our boundaries. Who is the nation? How is our nation defined? And in these societies, it was typically defined in terms of association with the soil. There was a common reference to blood and soil. If you somehow are responsible for agriculture, well, good, you're part of the nation. You're a landowner, or more particularly, a peasant or a small farmer. You're part of the nation. This branch of anti-Semitism, this cause of anti-Semitism, is, I think, too seldom mentioned, but it was popular. It remained popular even after the Industrial Revolution and people moved to the cities. Industry is based there. And you have countries starting to become majority urban instead of overwhelmingly rural. And one of these groups that exploited the idea of Jews as being bad because they, among other things, always lived in the cities and towns was they tried to appeal, building their base, they tried to appeal to small farmers, saying basically, you are the real Germans, you're the real nation. And of course, the Jews were left out of that equation. Here's a high-ranking Nazi, at least he was high-ranking in the 1930s, Walter Doré, was speaking at a blood and soil, that was the group he was associated with, rally, and here's something he wrote. At the bottom of his heart, the true peasant has only a deep and mostly silent contempt for the city dweller or non-farmer. Another important thing that we see, very important, and we'll talk credits, was the idea of an international Jewish conspiracy. And we'll be talking about Hitler, who totally believed in this self-medical yours about it. But the idea of an international Jewish conspiracy likewise goes way back. We can find a very important example of it in the 1340s, when the Black Death, in the late 1340s, And your various explanations that were given as to why the Jews were somehow responsible for this plague, the most deadly of all pandemic. One of them, though, was that news from all over Europe, Jewish leaders of different communities from all over Europe, had congregated in Prague, and their leader had handed out vials of poison and had told them to go back to their respective towns and to poison the wells and spread the pestilence that way. And there were many who believed this accusation and believed that Jews had poisoned the wells. This is a late illustration of the idea. And like other accusations that basically the Jews were killing people, doing just things that couldn't possibly be accepted, Jews suffered for it. There were a lot of anti-Jewish riots prompted by a sense of the association between Jews and the Black Death during the 1340s. And Jews killed by mob actions, the biggest one in Mainz, 3,000 killed there. They'd managed to fight off their attackers for several days. In the annual Hallel, mass executions, was being burned in Germany in 1349. And this, by the way, despite the fact that the Pope, Clement VI, issued a bull saying that the Jews were not responsible for the Black Death, that they were dying from it too, and threatening to excommunicate anyone who harmed the Jews because they thought Jews were responsible for the Black Death. How was hatred of Jews communicated? Well, communicated in countless sermons, communicated by charismatic leaders, often upper class leaders. But toward the end of the Middle Ages, we have a couple of noise. One is the introduction of passion plays, which usually focused on the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus. And then you move into the 16th century, and passion plays basically become popular in the 15th century. 16th century, we have joining them, not replacing, but joining theater. The advent of theater, and often there we do have Jewish characters who are downright evil. As I say, Shylock is a more complex character, but if you want to find a really evil Jewish character, you can look to Barabbas, the villain in Christopher Marlowe's play, The Jew of Malta, who wants to basically bring in the Muslims and have them kill all the Christians. He absolutely hates Christians. At one point, Barabbas says to his servant or his slave, "Sometimes I go about on poisoned wells." The creature passes it, and one can imagine a audience of this period, this would have been written in the early 1590s, just the all nodding, yeah, that's what these Jews do. They go around and poison wells. Now, I would say, since I do like to balance things where I can, that sure, there were lots and lots and lots and lots of very negative portrayals of Jews. But there was the occasional moderate perspective. And I will give as my example on the Kale in the Decameron, the great work of Renaissance Italy, written in the around 1350 by Giovanni Boccaccio. The Saladin, the famous warrior, is suffering from a real shortage of money because he goes to war a lot. He knows that there is a fabulously wealthy Jew who lives nearby, a man named Melchizedek. And he invites Melchizedek to come to him at his court. And Melchizedek does so, and Saladin tries to spring a trap. He says to him essentially, there are Christians who think that their religion is the true one. There are Muslims who believe that their religion is the true one. There are Jews who believe that their religion is the true one. You tell me, which is the true religion? And he expects that Melchizedek is going to say, well, it's Judaism. And then he's going to have him arrested, fine him very, very heavily for having defamed Islam. But Melchizedek doesn't fall for it. He tells what is commonly known as the parable of the rings. It seems that in a particular family, a very wealthy family, that there was a beautiful, priceless ring descended from father to son and father to son and father to son, so on. And everything goes smoothly as long as the father has a favorite son to pass the ring down to. But finally, there is this man who has 3 sons and loves them equally. And he doesn't want to just give the ring to one of them, because the tradition is that whoever receives the ring is then recognized as being the leader of the family. He's going to be doing all the business. He's going to be the wealthiest one, have the most influence. The father hires very great craftsmen, and he has him make 2 perfect copies of the ring. And he then, when he's dying, he wills the ring to each of the 3 sons. And then after he dies, they start to argue over who has the original ring because they're all perfect copies. Finally, they give up and they say, there's just no way of knowing which is the real ring. We'll just kind of have to live with it. And Melchizedek winds up by saying, and it's the same with religions, or there's no way to know which is the true religion, just as there's no way of saying which is the true ring. Okay, so we have this moderate perspective. And by the way, variants of the Melchizedek story, parable of the rings, are found in a number of works in the late Middle Ages and thereafter too. So, not everything that was written about the Jews was bad. What the ultimate representation that was favored of the Jew was, how was he imagined ultimately? Was he imagined as a physician? There were lots of popular Jewish physicians in the Middle Ages. Maimonides was one of them. They were often considered the best. And when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, the Spanish court actually received petitions from several communities, from several towns around Spain saying, we have only one physician in town, and he's Jewish, but he's such a good physician. He's good to all of us, and he doesn't care if we can't pay. He's a good man, and we don't want him to have to leave. So there will be all these petitions coming in. And ultimately, it's not the image of the physician who is thought to represent what the Jew is like. It is moneylender, exploiter. And this image would not only linger, but it would transform over time. And the Jew as moneylender would become the Jew as filthy rich banker, or financier, or stockbroker. This was the common image, as we can see in this caricature from the Nazi period, of a fabulously wealthy Jew sitting on a bag of gold in front of a stock exchange. That's what they imagine. Here, this close association of Jews with wealth. Okay, now we can move into the next lecture. We're doing with 2, and now we're going into 3. Ebb and flow of hatred. 1500 to 19. The late Middle Ages, as I've already to some degree explained, was an age of expulsions, starting with England in 1290, then moving on into France, various states given because France had not congealed politically, and Jews were able to stay longer in some parts than others, but a date often given as 1306 goes beyond that. Certainly by 1500, the Jewish population in France would have been very small. In Spain in 1492, Portugal 1497, a number of German states, and so it goes. But we also see the spread of Jews and the spread of Jewish culture going on at the same time as they move elsewhere, as we have the 2 great divisions evolving between the Sephardic Jews who speak and write Ladino based on late medieval Spanish, and the Ashkenazic Jews who speak Yiddish, based on late medieval German. But wherever they went in Western and Central Europe, they faced isolation. Mind you, with isolation, to some degree came security. But Jews, as a matter of fact, had preferred not only to be living in towns, but to be living in sections that were walled off, so they had a little more security. Basically, we find the start of the age of the ghettos, quickly after 1500, specifically in 1516, when the Jews of Venice were required to live in these walled-off neighborhood, are not allowed to leave there except for good reason. name of this neighborhood of the Jews who were asked to occupy was the ghetto. Ghetto meant slag. The neighborhood had been dominated by an iron foundry, and slag was the residue, was the leftover waste product of the smelting process. So this was not a great neighborhood that they were given. And the neighborhoods that they were forced to move into, which became known as ghettos, the same as one in Venice was, they were definitely not choice places to be. They were typically places of poverty, heavily not giving them the ability to be as wealthy as they could be if they were living out in the general community. But let's move into a different theme. Talk about the Reformation. The most important historical event of the 16th century, the splitting apart of the Catholic Church, beginnings of Protestantism, which was Martin Luther. Luther, in his early writings, expressed some sympathy for the Jews. In 1523, shortly after his break with the church, with the Catholic Church, he wrote a brief work entitled Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, which we might think of as being a very surprising thing to say, but it was in terms of usage of that coin. People weren't supposed to be reminded that Jesus had a Jewish background. He also, in this booklet of his, says that Jews, the reason they're not converting to Christianity is because they're being horribly abused. They've been persecuted for centuries. And if they were treated more kindly and gently, then they would see the good side of Christianity and they would become Christian. So there's this writing in 1523, but it is a much lengthier work, 1543, that Luther is remembered concerning the Jews and their lives, in which he attacks Jews from page 1. And I will give you a page here. Cannot tolerate the Jews if we do not wish to share in their lies and blasphemy. First, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire, and this ought to be done for the honor of God and of Christianity. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds, which such idolatry and blasphemy are taught. Then he did what he often did in his writings. He appealed to a specific audience, men in power, the Duke, the class nobility in general, the ones who control different regions, different states within the complex, the conglomerate that was Germany. And he told them, to sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable devilish burden, the Jews. It's not clear why Luther turned on the Jews the way he did. There's lots of speculation. May have been that he had really thought back in 1523, when he wrote that sympathetic work, he may have thought that the reason they were not converting to Christianity was because they were being treated so badly. So if they were treated better, they would come, especially to his reformed Christianity. But that wasn't happening. And the same as we saw Muhammad at first being sympathetic to the Jews and then saying they're not coming to his faith, and he turns on them. So do we see Luther doing the same thing. But another thing about Luther is that he is very much a nationalist, and his Christianity is very much blended in with his attitude toward the German nation. And he has very strong this bias that I've talked about. What is the nation? The nation is the rural people. And there's an interesting passage. This is again the same work, Jews in Their Lives. In the quotation, "Let the young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spindle, and let them earn their bread. For it is not proper that they should want us to work in the sweat of our brow, and that they idle away their days at the fireside in laziness, feasting, and display." This is what this image of the Jew as a city person could do. It was the cause of a lot of antisemitism. And they talked about the importance of early Christians like Chrysostom as icons, very influential, and their words would last and be influential for centuries and centuries and centuries. Luther, very much an icon. And Protestantism in general, but Lutheranism in particular, his words about the Jews had considerable impact. But we should remember that when we get to the Nazi period, it's not that all Lutherans were hostile to the Jews. In fact, we find that the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and are much more heavily Lutheran, even as Germany. There's a percentage of the population, but certainly Luther, a tremendous icon. And the Nazis would exploit this very much in their attacks on the Jews. Okay. Let's talk a bit about papacy, the Reformation papacy, and virtually across the 16th century and well on into the 17th. Undeclared war, or sometimes it was declared, between Protestants and the Church. And a number of cults who condemned Protestants as heretics and wanted to see them treated accordingly. There were, however, some of them who were also really, really, really hostile to Jews. You see one of them, Paul IV, and immediately after he was made Pope in 1555, he issued a bull called Nemes Absurdum. It is totally absurd. And these are the opening words. It's completely senseless and inappropriate to be in a situation where Christian piety allows the Jews, whose guilt, while their own doing has condemned them to eternal slavery, access to our society, and even to live among us. He wanted Jews to have a very hard time. Really, you can go back to that letter that I read from Innocent III. Jews were supposed to live like vagabonds. That's what Innocent said. Jews were supposed to be desperately poor. They weren't supposed to be killed, but they were supposed to have a horrible life. And this is what they thought God wanted. The Jews would suffer. So how does it make them suffer? Well, as Pope, he is the head of the so-called Papal States. He is the lay ruler in the Papal States, just as at the same time he is the spiritual ruler of the Catholic Church. So he wants the Jews to suffer. He orders that Jews living in the Papal States be restricted to ghettos, beginning with the ghetto in Rome itself, that which is set up then. And these are to be super ghettos, absolutely the worst of the worst of the worst. He allowed the Jews, and this is the bull, he allows them just one trade, one thing that they can do legally, make money, and that is that they can be rag pickers. That is to say, they can go through trash heaps and pick out bits of cloth or clothing, try to sell them for a pittance. That was the only thing they could do legally. Obviously, they were not going to do very well financially. Nobody ever got rich being a rag picker. That was the idea. The Jews were supposed to lead a horrible, impoverished existence. Moreover, we find that elsewhere in the Papal States, towns and cities are encouraged to set up ghettos on the same model as the Roman ghetto, where Jews will lead a horrible life. These were the worst ghettos in Europe. The Rome ghetto itself, the ghetto that was in Rome, lasted longer than any of these ghettos. It was not abolished until 1871, after the institution of the Papal States ended. So there was certainly anti-Semitism on both sides, Protestant and Catholic. But I would like to talk also about different Protestant traditions. Is Calvinism. And we find that there is imbalance, a significantly different attitude toward Jews than more positive one. First of all, of course, there's tradition after the French scholar John Calvin, and they would include a number of churches, usually Reformed was somewhere in their name, like Dutch Reformed or Swiss Reformed, but also Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, and others, Calvinist. And they tended to be much more kindly inclined toward the Jews. And it would be one Puritan, or actually an independent, sort of antecedent to the Congregationalists, whose name I'm familiar to you. Oliver Cromwell, who ruled England for much of the 1650s. He was not a king. He was up there because he was a general. He was a Puritan or independent, but anyway, he was a very powerful individual. And it was he who, in 1555, invited the Jews back to England remember they been expelled in 2090. Well, that was not coincidental. The Calvinists, they were like many other people. They were looking for signs of God's will. They were trying to interpret what God's will was. They tended to be very much into eschatology, basically a branch of theology that deals with the final days of humanity, which will wind up either horribly with mass destruction, or perhaps after the last judgment, will wind up in a heaven on earth situation for the righteous. But anyway, the end of days. And it was a common belief in the 19th century. Somehow the Jews had a lot to do with bringing on the last days. They had a Judeo-centric view. The Jews were somehow involved with this, the grand design of God. Cromwell, as I say, very much believed this. It became a popular notion in this time among the Calvinists. If Jesus could not return, if the Jews were not allowed to return to their ancestral homeland, to return to the Holy Land. Anyway, the Calvinists tend to be much more supportive of the Jews. And another characteristic of this theory is that we see more Jews reaching out to Christian audiences. And I will mention the one, and is probably the most important one, this fact. This is Manasseh ben Israel. And Israel was born in La Rochelle in France, which had a very small community of Jews, but it had a large community, though, of Huguenots. The French Huguenots were another of the Calvinist groups. And he and his parents were well treated there. Later on, he moved on to the Netherlands, which was coming on more and more under the control of the Dutch Reformed Church, which was another Calvinist church. Manasseh ben Israel starts writing works that appeal to Christians, and most notably the Calvinists. And here is what he writes in the famous work of his, The Hope of Israel, which was published in 1652 and contains this passage. It may be seen that God hath not loved us, most of course being the Jews. If one persecutes us, another treats us civilly. If one banishes us out of his country, another invites us with 1,000 privileges. And do we not see that those republics do flourish and much increase in trade who admit the Israelites? In other words, they're looking to, we have people who are trying to imagine what is God's design. And okay, he's telling them, basically, you want good things to happen to you, you want to flourish, okay, be good to the Jews, and God will reward you. Among the readers of this Hope of Israel was Cromwell. It helped to inspire his decision to invite the Jews back to England. Well, finally, ramifications for Jews of the Protestant Catholics. Look, we do find it that at least Calvinism tends to be more sympathetic to the Jews than either Lutheranism or Catholicism. But also, the Jews benefit from the frequent wars, instead of having armies attacking the Jews, ancient armies were attacking Catholics. Catholics were attacking Protestants. You have about a century and a half of religious wars during the most of the 16th century and on into the first half of the 17th. Because of this, the spotlight goes off the Jews. Previously, the Jews were looked on as the great enemies by fellow Christians. These great enemies after the Muslims were pushed out. Then it was the Jews. They were a focus. It was a very unwelcome and dangerous spotlight that they were in. Now they're not in the spotlight. The enemy is not so much the Jews, Catholics, it's Protestants. The Protestants is Catholics. So we find that the Reformation is largely good for the Jews. And we see moderating attitudes in, at this point, I'll just say Western and Central Europe. We'll be elaborating on this later on. How far did it go? We can certainly say that there was violence toward Jews during the 16th and early 17th centuries. A very dramatic case came in 1614 in Frankfurt in Germany. The baker named Vincent Redmill started to verbally assault the Jews, all whom he accused of being very rich and taking advantage of their wealth. This stirred up a mob to attack Frankfurt. And you can see from this illustration's famous depiction of that assault, first of all, you can again see men wearing those Jewish badges, the circle of cloth, so onto their cloak. They are fighting back here. But we can also see those who are attacking the ghetto, and that what they are particularly there for is to steal stuff. So you see them grabbing money, grabbing goods, whatever, from the Jews. Moreover, these Jews, after this assault, were banished by the town authorities. But we also find a statement of one of the victims recalling, wherever we came, everyone, Jew and Christian alike, showed us goodwill. As for Fetnel, he was executed in 1616. Well, that was an action focused on the decision made by the Holy Roman Emperor. So the government did not want this sort of thing going on, didn't want these assaults. And then we move into a phase where we can actually talk about philo-Semitism. Antisemitism is Jew hatred, philo-Semitism was Jew love on the part of non-Jews. And there is certainly some of that we can talk about in terms of notably the and early 19th centuries. And I'll give you a famous example. This is German literary figure, playwright Gotthold Lessing. Lessing had a noteworthy Jewish friend. This is Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was a German Jew much associated with the Haskalah, with the Jewish Enlightenment, the 18th century willingness to think in some cases in more secular terms, to see some aspects of Judaism as perhaps superstitious, and try to broaden it, try to make it more relevant to that period. I might mention that many of the Jewish scholars and rabbis did not like this, although they thought that it was going to be the ruin of Jews, and indeed, part of this concern was illustrated by Mendelssohn's old family. I mean, Mendelssohn was Jewish, but his sons all were baptized. I mean, they chose baptism. And this is why the famous composer, Felix Mendelssohn, or Moses Mendelssohn's grandson, was not Jewish. Anyway, Lessing is mainly remembered for a play that he wrote in the 1770s entitled Nathan the Wise. The character Nathan is based on his friend Moses Mendelssohn. He has him saying very wise things like, know this, that every country can produce great men, every country of every religion can produce great men. Also, very dramatically, you have Jewish emancipation, Jews given the rights any other citizen, full citizenship rights in country after country after country. The first state to emancipate Jews is France in 1791. This in association with the French Revolution. And then the French armies start to move out, invade country after country after country, and militate for them to emancipate their Jews. So we find the Netherlands, Belgium, a number of German states, emancipating their Jews, making them equal in every way with the Christians in society. Thought I'd also talk a bit about the Jews in British literature, especially 19th century. And the very positive attitudes that we see toward Jews, and in part with an individual who is not well remembered today. One of his poems is well remembered, but anyway, this was Leigh Hunt. Mainly a very important editor of an influential cultural journal, and a leader among romantics. He was close to Keats and Shelley and Byron and 10 of them. And he wrote a very interesting autobiography in which he devotes several pages to his great liking of the Jews. He does say early on that he can remember that when he was a young boy, there were still very public, hate-filled sermons directed against the Jews at Easter time. He very much condemns these. But he was also reaching out, and the Jews were reaching back. And he has this passage. I never forgot the Jewish synagogue and the courtesy with which strangers were allowed to see it. I had the pleasure before I left school of becoming acquainted with some members of their community who are extremely liberal toward other opinions and who, nevertheless, entertained a sense of the supreme being far more reverential than I had ever observed in any Christian, my mother excepted. Lots of indicators of really growing liberalism, even philo-Semitism. In this phase, I can talk about also a couple of major literary figures, novels particularly. First, we have Sir Walter Scott, through so many historical novels, but perhaps most famous of all, Ivanhoe, published in 1819, all set around 1200, where the title character is a very heroic knight who becomes friendly with a Jewish woman named Rebecca. And this is in part about their relationship. It's always friendly relationship. Both of them know that they cannot marry. It's not a romantic relationship at all. But they're very helpful to each other. And very respect each other. At one point, Ivanhoe rescues Rebecca when her life is in danger. At another point, though, she's a talented physician, and he treats him when he's badly injured and saves his life. In the end, though, she decides that she and her father, who at one point was kidnapped, that they really can't go on living in England anymore, so they head off to Spain. But before that, she gives a famous talk about how really our two peoples should get along better with each other. We're not that different. Rebecca, a very positively major literary figure, and people like this would become more common. You see literature moving along. Not that there were not some exceptions to the rule. This is Charles Dickens. Dickens, but his novels were characterized by realism rather than the romanticism of Scott's novels. And one of his most famous, published in 1838, was Oliver Twist. He wrote a band of children who are largely pickpockets. They go around stealing, and they give their money to a man named Fagin, who is a Jew, and who heads this group, kids, that for a time includes Oliver Twist. So Fagin is a Jewish terror. The interesting thing is not so much the novel itself as the condemnation that Dickens faced from the literary crowd. Didn't mind having a character like Fagin in the novel as the villain. What they minded was that he was specifically a Jew. They didn't like that. The age of the Jewish villain passed for the time being. And Dickens tried to defend himself. He tried to say, well, there are these men in the underworld who have these bands of children stealing things, giving them the money. And he said, and some of them were Jewish. But it didn't fly. And he finally, in one of his last novels, a novel called Our Mutual Friend, he has a character named Real, and he is a Jew and is so nice. He's a good guy that some critics believe he's just not plausible. Anyway, he's a very good Jew to perhaps compensate for the bad Jew in the character of Fagin. And I'm going to wind this up by talking about emancipation finally coming to England. Remind you, in 1753, there had been a bill introduced into Parliament which basically would have given Jews full citizenship rights, called the Jewish Naturalization Bill, or simply the Jew Bill. Well, and it was passed. However, then mobs started to attack, chanting, "No Jews, no wooden shoes." Wooden shoes were associated with poverty. The implication that Jews were making people poor. The bill was then rescinded. But in 1858, we have Parliament passing the Jewish Emancipation Act. And now Jews have the same rights as other Englishmen have. Its passage was engineered in large part by Benjamin Disraeli, the leader of the Conservative Party, and a very important prime minister later in the century. And he was born a Jew. However, his father had a falling out with our synagogue and had his children baptized, so he was raised as a Christian. But he was always proud of his Jewish roots and never discounted them or tried to pretend they didn't exist. So he supported it, but so did the Liberal leader, William Gladstone, also a very important prime minister. The Jewish Emancipation comes to England in 1858. It allowed Jews to enter Parliament without taking an oath that they were Christian and that they would execute the law in accordance with their Christian beliefs. Anyway, the first Jew to be elected to Parliament was found to this man. This was Lionel de Rothschild, who was a member of the fabulously rich, legendary family of bankers. I'll be talking more about calendar to do next weekend. He was the first Jewish MP. He also was admitted in 1858, the same year the Bill Emancipation Act was passed. But although he may have represented the stereotype of the Jew, involved and tremendously wealthy, in Holborn, a career that was geared to this. But we're going to see when we start off next Sunday that Jews are advancing, and they're not full bankers by any means. They're in lots of different fields. So there's also emancipation of real. We'll see some famous examples of that from the 19th century. Okay, so that's it for today. And thank you all. Thank you all. And we will be going on that Sunday.